The house smelled like rosemary and sea salt. I had marinated the chicken since morning, knowing he liked it with lemon zest. Not too sharp, just enough to wake up the tongue. It wasn't about impressing anyone. I just liked doing things right. That day marked 13 years of marriage, and I'd set the table with the linen we never used. The real one, not the synthetic blend. He came into the kitchen and kissed my cheek the way he always did. Warm, automatic, brief. Then he reached for the wine and asked if I'd remembered to invite my old friend from high school. I nodded. Her RSVP had come through a week ago. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that she wasn't coming alone. When the doorbell rang, I wiped my hands on the dish towel and smiled as I opened it. She was there, her familiar perfume already in the hallway, but next to her stood someone else. Taller than I remembered. Broader, older. He had the same dark hair as she did, only his was unkempt in a way that didn't seem careless, just uninterested in approval. My son, she said with a laugh, as if she had to explain his presence. He's tagging along for the weekend. Plans fell through. He nodded at me, polite, reserved. His eyes met mine briefly, and I felt it before I could name it. Something compact and quiet, like a pulled string that hadn't yet snapped. Dinner was smooth. My husband poured the wine, my friend told stories I'd heard before, and her son spoke almost not at all. He listened the way people do when they're watching from behind glass. Attentive, but distant. Only once, as I was lighting the candles, did I feel his gaze linger. Not inappropriately, not even confidently, but with a weight that made me want to smooth down my dress and adjust my neckline, even though it wasn't low to begin with. He sat across from me. His hands were large, veined, sun-browned. When he spoke, his voice was lower than I expected. He didn't offer stories or jokes, only questions about the house, the area, how long we'd lived here. And always with that same gaze that didn't settle long enough to be direct, but didn't shy away either. After they left the table, my friend heading upstairs to the guest room, my husband to his office. Just to finish something, I began clearing the dishes. I carried the platters to the kitchen, rinsed them under warm water, and noticed the empty wine bottle. I hadn't realized we'd gone through it. It had felt like less. The night had cooled. I remembered the scarf I'd left draped on the back patio chair. It was one of those stupid details that stick to your thoughts like burrs, and I went outside barefoot, wrapping my arms against the breeze. The scarf was there, curled like a sleeping animal. As I picked it up, I heard the door slide behind me. "You forgot this," he said. I turned. He stood inside, holding the corkscrew I'd left on the counter. I nodded. "Thanks." We stood for a second longer than necessary, and it was that kind of silence you don't fill. Not because there's nothing to say, but because adding sound would crack something open. Then I stepped inside, brushed past him slightly, and the brush wasn't accidental. I felt the warmth of his arm, the faint smell of wood smoke and soap. It hit me in a way I hadn't felt in a while. Not since before marriage became a routine we both respected more than we enjoyed. Back in the kitchen, I folded the towel again even though it didn't need folding. He placed the corkscrew beside the sink and walked away, but not before I caught that sideways glance again, the kind that doesn't ask anything, but dares you to imagine everything. I didn't sleep well. I lay next to my husband, whose body I knew by heart but whose presence no longer filled me. His back was turned. He'd fallen asleep early, and I watched the window for far too long. The moonlight was cold on the glass, like someone watching from the outside. And maybe, for the first time in years, I wanted to be seen. Not politely, not as wife, not as someone efficient and responsible and quietly desirable, but as a woman, a full one. That night, something in me shifted. Nothing happened, and yet everything had moved a fraction to the side, just enough to make me notice the gap. I woke up before the alarm. My husband was still asleep, his back turned toward me in the same position he always took, like he'd marked his side of the bed years ago and saw no reason to revisit the border. There was no anger in the silence between us, no arguments left suspended in the air, Just a kind of emptiness that made everything feel soft around the edges. Comfortable, yes, but not warm. Like the difference between being held and being kept. I slid out of bed quietly, careful not to shift the sheets too much. The floor felt cold under my bare feet, but I didn't mind. In the kitchen, the light came in pale and watery, filtered through the coastal fog that clung to the windows. I pulled on a light sweater. Soft, form-fitting, no bra underneath. Not for attention. Just for the feeling of fabric against skin. For the reminder that I had a body beneath the roles and routines. He was already awake, sitting in the living room with a mug in his hand, barefoot like me. No phone, no TV, just him in the quiet. He nodded when I walked in but didn't speak. That restraint, that ease with silence, felt like something rare, something that didn't ask to be filled. I started the coffee, trying not to fumble with the machine. His eyes were on me. I felt them, though I didn't turn. Not intense or inappropriate, just attentive. Like he was noticing things others missed, not because he was trying to, but because that's who he was. And for reasons I didn't yet understand, that made me stand a little straighter, breathe a little shallower. We moved around the house as if on parallel tracks, close, but never quite touching. Until we did. In the hallway, I was carrying plates, and he came around the corner with a book in hand. We bumped shoulders. Barely. It could have passed for an accident. But neither of us stepped away. He paused, just long enough that I felt it. That space. That question. I looked up, and his gaze wasn't locked to mine. It flicked to the side of my mouth, lingered there like he was waiting for something unsaid to surface. "Sorry," he murmured. "It's fine," I answered, more breath than voice. But it wasn't fine. It wasn't nothing. And we both knew it. He moved on, casual, but I stood still, my chest tight, my spine alert. Something inside me had shifted. Slightly. Quietly. But the shift was real. Later, in the kitchen again, our movements aligned. I reached for the kettle. He rinsed a cup. We shared the space without speaking. He handed me a towel, and when our fingers met, it was electricity. Quiet, pulsing, undeniable. Then he stepped closer. Not sudden, not forceful. Deliberate. My breath caught. We were close enough that I could see the stubble on his jaw, the faint line of sleep still softening his eyes. He reached up, brushed a strand of hair from my face, and paused. His hand lingered near my cheek. I didn't move away. He leaned in slowly, and his lips touched mine. It wasn't greedy. It wasn't hesitant. It was searching, like a question with no words. And for a second, the world narrowed to that one moment, that single, fragile moment. Then it was over. He stepped back, not because I pulled away, but because he knew that was enough. For now. I stayed there, hand resting lightly on the counter, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't feel guilty. Not yet. I felt awake. Back in my bedroom, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My lips looked different. Fuller, flushed, like they'd been reminded of their purpose. My skin tingled where his fingers had been. Nothing about me had changed. And yet everything had. I lay back down, and moments later, my husband shifted toward me in his sleep. He mumbled something incoherent and reached for my thigh. Not with passion, but habit. Like checking that I was still there. That I hadn't disappeared during the night. And I hadn't. But I wasn't entirely present either. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. My body buzzed. My mind circled. I had stepped into something I couldn't undo and didn't want to. I didn't crave chaos. I didn't want to hurt anyone. But I was tired of being untouched in all the ways that mattered. I didn't know where this would go. I only knew one thing. I would not pretend I hadn't felt it. And I would not pretend I didn't want more. My husband suggested a drive into town that morning. Said we could all go together. Him, me, and the boy. The market on the square was hosting some sort of antique fair, and he thought it might be a nice change of pace. His words, the same tone he used when recommending a walk after dinner or switching brands of toothpaste. Always polite, always reasonable. But somewhere beneath his calm was a constant low hum of detachment. He knew how to organize life, but not how to color it. The boy came downstairs just as I was slipping on my flats. He carried a denim jacket over his shoulder and ran one hand through his hair in a gesture that felt unintentionally cinematic. When our eyes met, I didn't smile. I didn't need to. There was something unspoken already living in the air between us, like a wire running low to the ground, waiting for one of us to step too close. I sat in the front passenger seat. My husband drove. The boy took the back. For most of the drive, I stared out the window, but I could feel the rhythm of his breath behind me. I was hyper-aware of every turn, every bump, every pause at a stoplight. Once, I adjusted the rearview mirror and caught his reflection. He was looking out his own window, but his eyes shifted just slightly, acknowledging me. Not flirting, not invading, just present. At the market, the three of us meandered separately. My husband wandered toward the vintage books, and the boy followed me loosely through the maze of vendors. I stopped at a stand selling old jewelry and ran my fingers along a tray of tarnished silver. I didn't need anything. I wasn't shopping. I was stalling. A few minutes later, my husband reappeared beside us. He looked mildly distracted, said he'd bumped into an old colleague, and asked if we'd mind if he stayed a while longer, grabbed a drink with him. I said no. Of course not, go ahead. He didn't even glance at me when he kissed my cheek and said he'd Uber back later, as if we were roommates making separate weekend plans. So it was just the two of us on the ride home. I offered to drive. He didn't argue. The road back was quieter. The trees blurred past in streaks of green and gold, the afternoon sun catching on the windshield. He didn't say much, and neither did I. But silence, I was learning, could be as intimate as touch. About halfway through the drive, I reached to adjust the volume on the radio. My hand brushed his knee. Light, casual, and yet I felt it down to the marrow. He didn't move. I didn't apologize. I don't know which of us crossed that line first. Maybe it was both of us at once. Back home, I headed upstairs to change. I peeled off the day's outfit slowly, as if my body were still listening. I stood in front of the closet for longer than necessary. Then I reached for a silk camisole I hadn't worn in years. It was ivory, with lace trim and delicate straps that slipped too easily off the shoulder. I put it on without a bra. Then jeans, fitted, darker wash, the kind I usually reserved for evenings out. I added a light cardigan that hung loosely, almost deliberately undone. I don't know what I was dressing for. Not for dinner, not for him, not even for me exactly. It was more like I was preparing to be seen, not by the world, but by one person. One set of eyes that didn't skim over me the way others did. When I came back downstairs, he was in the backyard, leaning against the deck railing, sipping from a water bottle. The wind caught his hair just slightly, enough to reveal a strip of his neck, and for a brief second I had to stop. Not out of hesitation, out of recognition. He turned at the sound of the door. His gaze dropped from my face to my collarbone, then back again. Not obvious, not inappropriate. Just anchored. He didn't speak, neither did I. But my skin lit up under his eyes. We stayed like that for a moment. Me in the doorway, him against the railing. The air between us stretched tight, like the surface of still water before the first drop breaks it. Later, when I was in the kitchen pouring wine, I saw him again through the glass door. His reflection superimposed on mine. His stillness was a kind of language. So was the fact that he didn't come in. At dinner, we sat with my husband. The conversation drifted to work, to mutual acquaintances, to the state of the front lawn. I nodded in the right places, smiled when I was expected to, but I could feel the camisole against my skin with every breath, like a whisper reminding me I was no longer just someone's wife. That night, alone in the bathroom, I undressed slowly. My body felt new, not because it had changed, but because I had started paying attention to it again. I touched the strap of the camisole, traced its shape down my shoulder. My skin was warm. Not from the shower, not from the wine, but from the electricity of being watched and wanting it. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew this. I wouldn't pretend anymore. Not to myself. Not to my reflection. I slid into bed beside my husband, his breathing steady and detached. He turned over once, murmured something about meetings in the morning, and pulled the blanket to his chin. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the silence settle around us. Somewhere in the house, I knew, another heartbeat matched the rhythm of mine. Not in sync, not together, but dangerously close. The outage came without warning. One minute, I was rinsing vegetables in the sink, the kitchen lit with soft golden light. The next, everything was swallowed in a quiet, thick darkness. No thunder, no flicker, just a sudden drop into shadow, like the house had exhaled and forgotten how to inhale again. The silence after was a different kind of silence. Not peaceful, not empty. It had weight. I stood still, palms wet, water still running though I couldn't see it. The only light was the fading evening outside, casting bluish shapes along the walls. I could hear a drawer open somewhere in the house. Not hurried, not startled, just movement. He was still here. My husband had gone into the city that morning for work and was staying the night at a hotel to avoid the long drive back. My friend had left a few hours earlier to meet someone for dinner. They both texted, casual, predictable updates. I responded with the expected emojis and reassurances. The part of me that still played by rules never missed a beat. The boy came into the kitchen just as I was drying my hands with a dish towel. He carried a small lantern, battery-powered, and set it down on the island. Its glow was soft, almost candle-like, throwing long shadows onto the cabinets. He didn't speak, just reached into a drawer, pulled out a few tea lights, and began placing them around the room with a quiet efficiency that made something twist inside me. I watched him work. His body moved with a calm I envied, as if nothing about the dark unsettled him, as if he belonged to it. When he lit the last candle, I said, "Thank you." My voice sounded strange in the room, too thin, too careful. He turned and nodded once. "You're welcome." That was all. Nothing else passed between us. And yet everything did. I opened the wine. Not out of nervousness, at least not only that, but because my hands needed something to do. I poured 2 glasses and handed him one without asking if he wanted it. He accepted it wordlessly. We sat in the living room, just far enough apart to be appropriate. The candlelight flickered on the walls, dancing over the framed photographs, the edges of books, the untouched pillows. The kind of scene that could have looked perfectly innocent to someone walking in from the outside. But nothing about how I felt was innocent. My entire body was a quiet riot, every nerve tuned to him. We didn't talk. The kind of silence that once would have made me fidget now felt like shelter, like something sacred. At one point, I shifted my position and the hem of my dress slid higher along my thigh. His eyes flicked there and back again in less than a second, but my skin burned for minutes after. Not from embarrassment, from awareness, from recognition. Time moved strangely. I don't know how long we sat like that. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. But when I stood to check the circuit breaker out of habit more than hope, he stood too. We both walked to the back hallway where the panel was. The lantern cast just enough light to show the outline of the switches, but I didn't touch them. I already knew what I would find. Nothing to fix. Nothing to change. Just a delay that would stretch the evening further than it was supposed to go. I turned to tell him not to worry about it, and he was close. Not invading, not posturing. Just present. His presence filled the hallway. Or maybe it filled me. The distance between us evaporated. I didn't move. Neither did he. His voice was soft. "You okay?" I nodded, but my breath caught before it reached the surface. His hand brushed my wrist, barely, and stayed there. My skin responded before I did. My fingers curled, involuntary, into themselves. He looked down, not at my chest, not at my mouth, but at the line of my collarbone, just visible beneath the sweater I'd pulled on hours ago. The gaze wasn't ownership. It wasn't even desire in the usual sense. It was hunger of a quieter kind. Recognition. A silent understanding that what was happening between us had been building, not bursting. I stepped back, not to escape, but because I needed space to breathe. He let his hand drop, respectful, patient, but his eyes didn't leave mine. "I'm going to light a few more candles," I said. My voice was back to steady. "I'll help," he answered, and we walked down the hall without touching again. Back in the living room, we moved like people who had already touched but were pretending they hadn't. Every step was measured. Every breath counted. When he finally went upstairs to the guest room, he turned back at the top of the stairs. Our eyes met again, and the air between us pulsed with something too large to name. He didn't say goodnight. I didn't need him to. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed long after brushing my teeth, staring at the doorway like it might make a decision for me. The house was quiet. My phone blinked with a message from my husband. A photo of the hotel room, a quick note. "Everything's fine. See you tomorrow." I stared at the screen for a long time, then turned it face down on the nightstand. I climbed into bed wearing nothing but a thin tank top and underwear. Not because I expected anyone to see me, but because my body was awake, pulsing, hungry in a way it hadn't been in years. And somewhere above me, behind a closed guest room door, I knew another body was lying just as still, breathing just as shallow, holding the same tension in the chest, unsure whether to fight it or feed it. We were still pretending, but the pretense was running out of time. The next morning arrived muted, overcast. The sky a smooth stretch of pale gray like someone had erased the edges of the world. I moved through the kitchen on instinct, measuring coffee, slicing fruit, performing gestures that had lost their meaning long ago. The rituals of routine were comforting in their uselessness. They filled the silence but never answered it. He came down late, his hair still damp from a shower, wearing a plain black t-shirt and jeans that clung slightly at the hips. He said nothing at first, just reached for a glass of water, his body slow, deliberate. I watched the muscles move under the fabric of his sleeves, the way his fingers curled around the glass. I was no longer surprised by how hyper-aware I'd become of his every gesture. I didn't flinch from it anymore. I let myself feel it. My husband had texted that morning saying he might be delayed another night. Some unexpected work obligation, meetings that ran longer than expected. I read the message and then deleted it, like wiping away a fingerprint from a mirror. No anger, no relief, just space. More time. It was my idea to go to the coast. I told him I needed the air, the openness, that I hated how small the house felt with the power still flickering on and off. He didn't ask questions, didn't probe, just nodded and grabbed a jacket. We left quietly, like two people stepping out of a frame they no longer fit into. The drive was quiet. I let him choose the music. Some instrumental album I didn't recognize. It was all strings and low percussion, the kind of sound that holds emotion without explaining it. I liked that. We didn't talk, but there was no tension in the silence anymore. We were past that. The space between us wasn't about avoidance. It was permission. The coastline was mostly empty when we arrived. Off-season, a weekday, just wind and the steady, timeless churn of the ocean. I parked at the edge of the cliff where the road curved down toward a small overlook. We stayed in the car, windows cracked, the salt air sneaking in. He looked out, elbows resting on his knees, silent. I followed his gaze, watched the waves pull and return like breath. My hands were still on the steering wheel, but I wasn't really holding it. It was the kind of moment that should have had a script, some kind of declaration or confessional. But life isn't a movie. No music swelled, no wind changed. There was only the sound of his breathing, slow and careful, and my own heart trying to keep pace with something it didn't understand. When he reached for me, it wasn't sudden. His hand moved like it had already been there, just waiting to be noticed. He didn't take my hand. He touched the inside of my wrist, lightly, the pad of his thumb brushing over the thin skin, where my pulse beat steady and traitorous. I turned toward him, and he turned too. Our eyes met. I didn't close the distance between us. I didn't have to. He leaned in, one hand rising to my jaw, the other resting on the back of my seat. His lips met mine with no warning, no question. It wasn't soft this time. It wasn't exploratory. It was certain. His mouth moved over mine like he already knew the shape of it, like he'd memorized it in some dream and was now only tracing the lines. I kissed him back. Not cautiously, not tenderly. My fingers gripped the front of his shirt, the fabric cool against my palms, and I let the tension that had been coiling inside me for days, maybe years, unwind. When he pulled back, he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I looked at him, my breathing uneven, my body still leaning forward, and felt that strange, beautiful ache of something being broken and rebuilt at the same time. The drive back was silent again, but different. Charged. Every glance, every pause at a red light felt like the echo of something unspeakable. Back home, we walked into the house with the casualness of people returning from errands. No one would have guessed anything had happened. And yet everything had. I went upstairs to change, sat on the edge of the bed, and pulled off my clothes slowly. My lips still tingled. My skin still hummed. I caught my reflection in the mirror and studied it like a stranger might. Someone meeting a woman they didn't quite recognize but found compelling. Downstairs, I heard him moving through the kitchen. The ordinary sounds of a glass set down, a door closing, footsteps across hardwood. Mundane, familiar, but layered now with something deeper, something irreversible. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband, who had finally returned. He talked about the meetings, the traffic, how drained he felt. I nodded, even added a comment or two. He kissed my forehead and rolled onto his side, back toward me, as always. And I stared at the ceiling again. But this time, I didn't feel alone. I felt watched, remembered, desired. I felt marked. I tried to return to the rhythm of things, to the cadence of domestic normalcy. I made the bed with extra precision the next morning, folding hospital corners as if tight sheets could hold a crumbling life together. My husband had left early, and I lingered in the quiet of the house long after the front door had closed behind him. I walked barefoot across the cold floor, wiped down already clean counters, and rearranged books on the shelf for no reason other than needing to touch something that didn't breathe. He didn't come down until late. By then, I'd already gone through the motions of breakfast and a half-hearted attempt at replying to emails. When he finally appeared, there was a noticeable pause in my body, as if some subconscious part of me still hoped yesterday was a dream. But the ache in my mouth told me otherwise. We didn't speak beyond necessities. A brief exchange about the weather, a shared glance over coffee mugs. He didn't ask to be alone with me. He didn't pull me aside. And yet, when our hands reached for the same glass at the sink, neither of us let go. Our fingers touched for the briefest moment, and then separated. But the air between us didn't reset. It vibrated. Throughout the day, we moved carefully, like dancers who knew the choreography too well and were now trying to resist it. Every time we crossed paths, in the hallway, on the stairs beside the laundry room, I could feel him pause half a second too long. My body did the same. I hated myself for it. A little. But not enough to stop. By mid-afternoon, I stood in front of my closet and stared at the rows of clothes like they might offer some sort of absolution. I didn't want to be seductive. I didn't want to manipulate. But I did want to feel the heat of his eyes again. I chose a soft knit dress that clung in all the right places without trying too hard. Underneath, I wore the lingerie I hadn't touched in years, ivory with delicate stitching. The kind I used to buy when I still believed in the idea of being surprised by someone's hunger for me. I didn't dress for him. I dressed for the possibility of him. When I passed him in the hallway later, he looked up from his book, and I knew he saw it. His jaw flexed ever so slightly, the way it did when he was trying to concentrate. I didn't stop walking. I didn't smile. But the scent of my perfume lingered in the space after I left, and I heard the pages stop turning. Later, my husband called to say he'd be late again. A meeting, a delay, a traffic excuse. His voice was flat with exhaustion, and I found myself nodding along even though he couldn't see me. When the call ended, I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone down with an odd calm. That night, we all sat down to dinner. Me, my husband, and the boy. My friend was still out of town, extending her trip by a few days. We ate in near silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware and the occasional murmured comment about the food. My husband didn't notice the way I glanced at the boy when I thought no one was looking. But the boy noticed, and he didn't look away. When my husband excused himself to take a work call, I began clearing the plates. The boy stood as well, reaching to take them from me, his fingers brushing mine again. My breath caught. It was stupid. So small. But my skin responded like it had memory. We were standing side by side at the sink, not speaking. Our arms touched slightly. Not enough to be overt. Just enough to remind us both of what we weren't doing. Of what we had done. When he finally stepped back, I thought he might say something. A whisper. A plea. A warning. Instead, he picked up the dish towel and handed it to me. His fingers lingered on mine. Just for a second. And then he left the room. I leaned against the sink, letting the water run over my hands, too hot to be comfortable. The tension was unbearable, because it wasn't the kind that ended in confrontation. It was the kind that built slowly, patiently, until it had nowhere else to go. That night, as I lay in bed next to my husband, I realized something terrifying. I didn't feel guilty. Not yet. What I felt was absence, not of morality, not of consequence, but of him, my husband. There was nothing in his movements that reached me anymore. No touch that startled me. No glance that made my breath catch. We had become efficient in our partnership. Polite, functional, distant. And across the hall, another body existed. One that had touched me not with dominance or demand, but with awareness, with attention. And I wanted more. God help me, I wanted more. But I also wanted to pretend I didn't. So I turned off the lamp, rolled to my side, and closed my eyes. And lay awake for hours, aching without motion. She came back without warning. The sound of the front door unlocking mid-afternoon wasn't jarring in itself. It was the timing. I was in the kitchen, alone, stacking dishes from lunch. He was upstairs, presumably showering after a run. The house had been quiet for the better part of the day, each of us moving through it like waves barely touching shorelines, until the sound of her suitcase wheels scraping across the entryway tile snapped that rhythm in half. I blinked, heartbeat skipping. My hand froze around the rim of a coffee mug. Her voice carried through the hallway like an echo from another life. The normal one. The version where nothing had happened, where guilt wasn't pulsing quietly in my bloodstream. She appeared in the doorway, sunglasses still perched in her hair, scarf knotted effortlessly around her neck. She looked refreshed, amused, utterly unaware. And then she wasn't. Because a second later, he came down the stairs. His shirt was damp, clinging slightly to his torso. Hair towel-dried. Breath still slowing from exertion. And when he saw her, his mother, he paused just a fraction too long. His eyes flicked to me, then back again. A nearly invisible motion. But she caught it. Her gaze moved from him to me, then back again. A beat passed. Her lips twitched. Not a smile. Not surprise. Something in between. "I see the house survived without me," she said, pulling off her scarf. "Looks cleaner than when I left." I mumbled something about early mornings and boredom. She nodded slowly, as if parsing a subtext I wasn't offering. Then she stepped inside the kitchen, placed her bag by the island, and reached for the fruit bowl with a deliberateness that felt almost surgical. I knew she was watching me. Not openly, but through small slivers of silence. Pauses that stretched too long, glances that hovered just 1 second too much. There was no confrontation. Not yet. But something in the air had changed. She could feel it. Not evidence. Not facts. Just a shift in atmosphere that people who've known you too long can smell before you speak. Later that evening, we sat around the dinner table like we always had. My husband had come home early and was in an especially good mood. Something about a project going through. The boy sat quietly, saying just enough to blend in. And she performed. Stories from her trip, sarcastic commentary about overpriced massages, a few jokes aimed at me with a blade buried deep inside them. "You look different," she said once, during dessert. "Something about the way you carry yourself. Spa envy, maybe?" I smiled tightly. "Or just better sleep." She murmured, stirring her coffee. "You've always been good at hiding things behind politeness." The room didn't freeze. The air didn't shift. No one noticed. Except me, and him, and her. After dinner, my husband offered to clean up. I insisted I'd do it, but he waved me off, dragging his chair back with a flourish of domestic good intentions. She moved into the living room, curled up on the corner of the sofa with a magazine. The boy lingered at the edge of the room, clearly caught in the weight of everything unspoken. I went to the sink and began washing plates slowly, too aware of how he was still standing behind me. I felt him step closer, the warmth of his presence brushing my back. My skin tensed, my hands submerged deeper into the water, fingers trembling beneath the surface. "I shouldn't have stayed," he said under his breath, not accusing, not apologizing, just stating a fact that now hovered between us, unresolvable. "You already did," I answered quietly. Silence stretched like a tight wire. "I didn't want to leave." I turned slightly, catching his reflection in the window above the sink. The ghost of him there, behind my shoulder, eyes shadowed, jaw tight. "You should," I said, "before this becomes something it can undo." But neither of us moved. Behind us, the clink of dishes and laughter from the other room continued like background noise in a life we were no longer living. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood on the back patio in my robe, arms wrapped tight around myself. The night was cool, the kind of chill that clung to your skin but didn't sink in. I sipped wine I didn't want, watching the dark beyond the railing. The door creaked open behind me. I didn't turn. I knew it was him. He didn't say anything. Just stood next to me, close but not touching. We looked out at nothing together. And for the first time since it started, I was afraid. Not of getting caught. Not of shame. But of how much I wanted him to reach for me again. Of how much of myself I'd already given in silence. I had forgotten how guilt could behave like a guest. Arriving late, making itself comfortable and refusing to leave. It didn't scream. It didn't accuse. It just sat quietly at the edge of everything, folding itself into daily motions, stirring cream into coffee, folding towels, answering messages. I moved through the week as if dragging a weighted blanket I hadn't chosen to carry. My husband sensed it, I think, though not in the way that mattered. He noticed the tension in my shoulders, the longer pauses before I answered, the fact that I'd stopped wearing the pale lipstick he always said he liked. But he read it as stress, as weariness. And in a way, he wasn't wrong. I was tired. Tired of splitting myself into pieces that no longer belonged together. One evening, he brought home a necklace. A thin silver chain with a small pendant. Elegant, understated. He said he saw it in a shop window and thought of me. It was the kind of gesture he used to make when we were newly married. Back when he remembered my ring size and how I liked my tea. I held it in my palm and tried to summon the version of myself who would have felt flattered, warmed, excited. Instead, I managed a quiet thank you, which he accepted with a kiss to my forehead. I felt his lips land, soft and fleeting, and I wondered when that spot on my skin had stopped feeling anything at all. The necklace sat on the nightstand for 2 days before I wore it. Not for him, not even for me. But because pretending required props, the boy had become quieter around me. Not distant, just restrained. Our conversations, when they happened, were reduced to surface-level exchanges. He asked how I slept. I asked if he needed anything from the store. We talked like people who hadn't pressed mouths together in the heat of a parked car with the ocean raging beside them. But in the spaces between words, everything remained. The way his gaze lingered a second too long when I passed him in the hallway. The way my breath changed when I heard his footsteps on the stairs. Our restraint wasn't recovery. It was deferral. A cord pulled tight, waiting. A few days later, I walked into the kitchen to find a note from him, scribbled on the back of a grocery list. Just a line. I'm staying with a friend for a few nights. Thought it might be better. For both of us. It was unsigned. I stood there holding the paper like it was an X-ray of something broken inside me. That night, the house felt emptier than I expected. Not quieter. There were still the usual sounds, the hum of the fridge, the muffled static of the television from the other room. But the silence had a different shape now. It pressed inward as if trying to get inside my lungs. My husband talked more than usual over dinner. Told me about a colleague who'd retired early, about a client who sent them a case of wine in gratitude. I nodded, smiled when required. But my hands stayed curled in my lap, clenched so tightly my nails left half-moons in my skin. Later, when we were both upstairs, he reached for me. Not roughly, not greedily, just like a husband who wanted to be close to his wife. I let him kiss me, let him touch my waist, let him unbutton the top of my blouse. My body complied. My lips responded. But I wasn't inside it. His hands were familiar. They knew the script. And that was the problem. I closed my eyes and imagined nothing. Not the boy, not the kitchen, not the car. Just blankness. It was the only way I could survive the sensation of being wanted without being seen. Afterward, he fell asleep quickly. I lay next to him in the dark, blinking up at the ceiling. My body was still, but my mind was a torrent. Not because of the act, not because of the betrayal, but because I hadn't felt anything. And that absence terrified me more than the guilt. The boy didn't call, didn't text. I didn't reach out either. We were both pretending. But pretending isn't erasure. It's a form of waiting. A few days later, I was at the market picking out lemons when I saw him. Across the aisle. Alone. He didn't notice me at first. His expression was tired. Older than he should have looked. When he did see me, he didn't smile. He didn't have to. Because his eyes said everything I hadn't let myself feel. Everything I had folded into corners and buried under laundry and dinner plans. We passed each other in the aisle without touching, without speaking. But as we did, I felt the air ripple between us like a sheet being lifted from a bed. I walked out of the store with a bag full of groceries I didn't need, and a heart I no longer knew how to carry. It was raining the day everything came to a quiet end. Not a storm. Not dramatic. Just that steady, gray kind of rain that soaks the earth without demanding attention. The kind that makes time feel slower, softer, like the world itself has agreed to pause. I stood at the kitchen window, holding a warm mug I didn't want to drink from, watching the droplets race down the glass. Each trail was a decision. Some turned left, others veered down the middle. A few disappeared completely. I wondered if that was how choices worked. Small, silent collisions that changed everything while pretending they hadn't. My husband was packing for a short work trip. 3 nights. A conference in Portland. He moved through the bedroom with his usual efficiency. Rolling shirts, matching socks, checking the forecast as if planning for rain could somehow prevent it. He kissed me goodbye like he always did. Brief. Routine. A brush of lips against temple, a hand on my lower back. I stood at the door, waved once as he pulled out of the driveway, then shut it behind him with a finality that felt ceremonial. The house was quiet again, but different. And I knew what I was going to do before I even allowed myself to think it. I didn't change clothes. I didn't check my reflection. I just put on my coat, locked the front door, and walked. It wasn't far, less than a mile. His friend's place. I'd never been there before, but I remembered the address from a package that had arrived by mistake. The street was lined with trees still clinging to the last of their autumn leaves. Wet yellow and orange mosaics clung to the pavement, blurred by puddles. When I reached the house, I paused at the gate, not hesitating, but breathing, not bracing myself for a scene, just allowing the moment to become real. He opened the door before I knocked. Maybe he'd seen me from the window. Maybe he just knew I'd come. He stepped back to let me in without a word. His face was unreadable, but not closed. His eyes scanned me like I was a book he'd been forced to put down halfway through. We stood in the hallway, the air thick with everything we hadn't said. I opened my mouth twice before any sound came out. "I'm not here to ask anything of you," I said. He nodded but didn't speak. "I'm not even sure why I came," I added. Still, he said nothing, just waited. So I walked past him into the living room, sat on the couch, looked around the unfamiliar space, the record stacked neatly in the corner, the mug half full of cold coffee on the table, the blanket tossed over the back of the chair. His life, quiet and lived without me. He sat across from me. Not close, not far. The silence stretched long between us. "I thought staying away would help," he finally said. His voice was rough around the edges, like it hadn't been used in days. "I thought it would make it easier." "Did it?" I asked. "No." I swallowed hard. My fingers curled around the seam of the couch cushion. I didn't know if I wanted him to say more or not. "I see you everywhere in that house," he continued, not because of what happened, because of everything that didn't. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words settle in me. My chest hurt, but not in a way that begged relief. In a way that confirmed I still had the capacity to feel. "I don't know how to be around you," I whispered. He leaned forward slightly. "Then don't try to be. Just be." I looked at him, really looked at him. Not with desire, not with longing. With something else. Something deeper. A terrible kind of knowing. The kind that arrives after the fire when all that's left is smoke and silence and the knowledge that you can never unknow what you've lived. "I can't keep doing this," I said. "I can't keep pretending to be who I was." "You're not," he said. A beat passed. "Not anymore." He didn't try to touch me, didn't offer comfort. That's what made it real. We'd moved past the part where comfort was a currency. This wasn't about hunger anymore. It was about weight. When I stood to leave, he didn't stop me. I didn't ask him to. We walked to the door together in silence. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky hadn't cleared. I paused at the threshold. He didn't speak, and I didn't promise to come back. Back home, the house greeted me with the usual stillness. The kitchen light hummed softly. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon and old wood. I went upstairs, took off my coat, sat on the edge of the bed. The necklace my husband gave me was still on the nightstand. I picked it up, let it dangle from my fingers for a long moment, then placed it in the drawer. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I didn't need to, because I understood now that love doesn't always leave loudly. Sometimes it just fades, like wallpaper in too much sun. And what's left behind isn't a story, or a tragedy, or even regret. It's a version of yourself you no longer recognize, and the echo of someone else's breath, still lingering in your skin.